On January 30th, 1933, a failed coup leader became Germany's chancellor through a perfectly legal process. The appointment surprised observers because, just 2 months earlier, newspapers across Germany had declared his political movement defeated, his party was financially broke, and his supporters were leaving in significant numbers. Hitler had nearly abandoned politics entirely. Within weeks, however, Adolf Hitler controlled the most powerful country in Europe. For decades, historians and the public believed Hitler rose to power through charisma, compelling speeches, or an unstoppable political movement. The actual explanation proves more complex. Hitler's success resulted from a specific set of conditions that existed in early 1930s Germany, part of a broader pattern of democratic collapse seen across Europe during this period. The Weimar Republic contained structural weaknesses from its founding, while economic disasters destroyed trust in democratic government, and political elites made a series of fatal miscalculations. A population facing multiple crises turned toward promises of belonging and national revival. Understanding this process requires examining the period beginning in November 1918, when Germany's defeat in World War I created a republic born from collapse. Section 1. Constitutional failures. In November 1918, after 4 years of World War I, the German Empire collapsed. Kaiser Wilhelm II fled to the Netherlands, and the old government fell overnight, leaving a republic born from complete defeat rather than victory. In his book Weimar Culture, historian Peter Gay explained that the Weimar Republic started without real support from most Germans, created by necessity rather than choice. Violence in the streets represented only part of the structural damage. Military leaders were simultaneously promoting a false narrative about the war's end. In the final months of World War I, General Ludendorff knew Germany's military situation was hopeless, which led him to urge the civilian government to request an armistice so the military wouldn't have to take the blame for defeat. Because no foreign army had invaded Germany itself and the fighting had happened in other countries, military leaders promoted a different narrative. Germany's army had been winning, they claimed, but domestic traitors had sabotaged victory from within. The November criminals became the target: Jews, socialists, and Democrats who supported the new republic. In his book Hitler's 30 Days to Power, historian Henry Ashby Turner documented how this stab-in-the-back legend reversed the actual sequence of events, allowing military leaders who had lost the war to escape responsibility, while civilians attempting to build democracy faced accusations of treason. Hindenburg and Ludendorff maintained this narrative, which permanently associated the Republic with national betrayal in the minds of millions. The consequences extended far beyond simple propaganda. This legend provided the foundation for everything that followed, determining why powerful figures would eventually support Hitler, why trust in democratic government eroded, and why demand grew for a leader who would restore national honor and punish perceived traitors. At the same time, the revolutions of 1918 and 19 created lasting fear among Germany's middle classes. The Soviet Union's example served as a warning, while communist uprisings in German cities made the threat seem immediate and concrete. Middle-class Germans feared losing their property, their status, and their economic security, fears that would shape political choices for years to come. Conservative leaders amplified the communist threat beyond its actual scope, constantly emphasizing the danger of revolution and potential property seizure. According to Turner, this fear became a crucial political tool, leading many Germans to decide they would accept authoritarian leadership rather than risk a communist takeover. The choice appeared to be between a strong government and the potential loss of homes and savings to revolution. Military defeat, political violence, and economic fear created lasting damage to the political system. The deeper problems with how democracy was designed would prevent recovery, and the treaty that officially ended World War I would make the situation far worse. Section 2. Economic collapse. On June 28, 1919, German representatives signed the Treaty of Versailles in the same hall where Germany had defeated France 48 years earlier, accepting terms that many Germans viewed as harsh revenge. Germany lost Alsace-Lorraine to France, the Polish corridor separated East Prussia from the rest of Germany, and all German colonies were taken away. Article 231, the War Guilt Clause, forced Germany to accept sole blame for causing the war, which extended beyond matters of money or territory into moral judgment. Germany had to pay 132 billion gold marks in reparations, an amount most Germans saw as economically impossible, while the military was restricted to 100,000 men with no tanks, no aircraft, and no submarines. The Rhineland would remain occupied by foreign troops and then kept permanently without any German military presence. As a result, the treaty became the explanation for every problem Germany faced. Economic trouble was blamed on the reparations, military weakness on the treaty restrictions, and national shame on the War Guilt Clause, which meant the republic that signed the treaty became permanently associated with these perceived injustices. Turner noted that the psychological damage ran deeper than the actual terms. Many Germans came to believe the treaty represented proof that Germany's enemies intended to keep the nation weak permanently. Historians examining the period identified deeper structural problems with how the government itself was designed. In his comprehensive study, The Coming of the Third Reich, Richard Evans pointed out that Bismarck's 1871 constitution resembled military rule with limited democratic elements, lacking any declaration of human rights or freedoms for citizens. Government ministers served the emperor or president rather than the parliament, while the army operated as a state within the state, independent of civilian control. The Weimar Constitution preserved these dangerous structures. Article 48 authorized the president to rule by decree during an emergency, but the Constitution never defined what qualified as an emergency, leaving the president as the only judge of when one existed. If Parliament objected to a decree, the president could simply dissolve Parliament and call new elections, then repeat the cycle. Democracy had been designed with its own self-destruct mechanism. While these structural problems weakened the government, an economic disaster destroyed public trust entirely. In 1919, one American dollar was worth 4 German marks, but by November 1923, $1 was worth 4.2 trillion marks. Savings accounts lost all purchasing power within months. Evans documented how people required wheelbarrows full of cash to purchase bread, while workers demanded payment multiple times per day so they could spend the money before prices rose again. Middle-class families who had saved carefully for retirement watched their life's work disappear, leaving those who had been economically stable suddenly facing poverty. The economic crisis left permanent damage. The middle class never forgot the hyperinflation of 1923, continuing to fear any hint of currency collapse even a generation later. Because of this, trust in government and economic systems eroded permanently, shaping political choices for years to come. In November 1923, Hitler made his first attempt to seize power. The beer hall putsch failed completely, sending Hitler to prison where he had expected to become a martyr. He had attempted an armed coup and tried to overthrow the government by force, yet he received a 5-year sentence but served only 9 months in comfortable conditions, spending the time writing his book. Communist activists, by contrast, received years in prison for distributing papers on street corners. Benjamin Carter Hett documented this pattern in The Death of Democracy, showing how the system was already tilted toward the right long before Hitler gained power. When justice depends on political identity rather than actions, democracy is already failing. Those institutions meant to defend democracy had already turned against it. Judges, professors, and church leaders opposed the republic from the beginning in most cases. Army officers remained loyal to the old monarchy, even after 1918. The army maintained its independence and political power, and universities became strongholds for Hitler's party before he came to power. The educated classes effectively betrayed democracy. Right-wing military groups had crushed left-wing uprisings with the government's approval, while political violence became normalized through uniforms, marching, and battle songs that became standard parts of politics. Hundreds died in political violence, and thousands more were injured. A powerful association developed in public consciousness. Democracy signified weakness, while violence signified strength. Police often refrained from stopping the fighting, judges handed down lenient sentences to right-wing offenders, and the message became clear that success in politics required demonstrations of force rather than reasoned argument. Long-standing prejudices against Jews also intensified during this period. Hatred of Jews was not new in Europe, where for centuries they had been treated as outsiders, and medieval restrictions kept them from most professions. When Jews finally gained legal rights in the 19th century, some Christians resented their economic success, while conspiracy theories claimed Jews controlled money, media, and government. However, Hitler's party didn't simply use existing prejudices. They made them far more extreme. Evans traced how earlier attitudes evolved into the regime's later program of systematic killing. A precedent for mass violence existed that most people have forgotten. In German Southwest Africa, today's Namibia, German forces killed 80% of the Herero people between 1904 and 1907, leading to tens of thousands of casualties, with survivors placed in concentration camps. This was not regarded as scandalous in Germany, where officers who carried out the genocide were promoted and honored, while the German public viewed it as normal colonial warfare. The lesson was clear. Violence against people labeled as inferior races could be organized, could be bureaucratic, and could be accepted. By 1923, multiple destructive forces had already entered Germany's political system. A republic born from defeat, a constitution with fatal flaws, and economic trauma from hyperinflation had created the conditions for instability. Political violence had become normalized. Elite institutions opposed democracy, and deep prejudices against minority groups were ready to be exploited. The damage from the war and its aftermath ran deep. When Hitler emerged from prison in late 1924, he had learned a crucial lesson. Armed revolution wouldn't succeed in Germany, but legal politics might. The conditions for what followed had been established. Section 3. Propaganda and Fear. Between 1925 and 1928, Hitler rebuilt his movement with a new strategy where the party would seize power legally rather than through force. The party's 1920 program had already called for canceling Jewish citizenship and expelling Jews from Germany, providing an ideological foundation. During his prison time in 1923 and 1924, he wrote Mein Kampf, laying out theories about propaganda that are disturbing partly because of how effective they proved to be. He also engaged in systematic practice to perfect his public performances. In his book, The Death of Democracy, historian Benjamin Carter Hett documented how the party leader's personal photographer, Heinrich Hoffmann, took picture after picture of him in speaking poses so he could refine every hand gesture and facial expression, while his devotee, Rudolf Hess, would role-play important visitors so the two could rehearse encounters before they happened. Hett noted that the famous outbursts were often calculated performances where emotional displays could be controlled and turned on or off for political impact. One-on-one, the approach would adapt entirely for each listener, moving seamlessly between different personas, reasonable statesman, revolutionary firebrand, or visionary artist, depending on what proved effective. This theatrical skill rested on systematic theories about controlling masses of people, theories laid out in Mein Kampf. The book viewed ordinary people with complete contempt, writing that the mass of people are lazy and cowardly, and that Germans weren't even as capable as the English on average. If Germans turned out to be weak, the text claimed, they would deserve elimination by stronger people. The extreme nationalist actually held his own nation in contempt, viewing Germans as inferior and weak, representing a plan to dominate people he despised rather than genuine patriotism. The theory of the big lie proved particularly effective. Great crowds, the book argued, will fall for a large lie more easily than a small one because a small lie might be questioned, but few would believe someone had the audacity to distort the truth so completely. The sheer scale of a massive lie makes it seem credible. The text then blamed Jews for being the great master of lies, which represented classic projection. Accuse enemies of exactly what you're doing so that when they accuse you, it sounds like they're simply repeating your charge. The theories emphasize that crowds don't respond to weakness or moderation. Propaganda must appeal to feelings rather than reason, while hatred works particularly well as a mobilizing emotion. All effective propaganda, the book stated, must limit itself to very few points and hammer on these slogans endlessly because complex arguments don't work on the masses. Simple slogans repeated constantly create reflexive reactions, functioning as conditioning rather than persuasion or reasoning. The party put these theories into practice with systematic efficiency, delivering different messages to different groups. Workers were promised jobs and heard attacks on Jewish capitalism. The middle class was promised a return to their former status and heard warnings about Jewish Bolshevism, while farmers received blood and soil ideology and promises of debt relief. Veterans heard about avenging the stab in the back and restoring military honor. Young people were told this represented a revolution of youth against failed elders. And women heard about protecting traditional family values and German motherhood. Each group heard what it wanted to hear, while no group heard the complete picture of what was actually planned. Meanwhile, the party built a comprehensive propaganda apparatus. Jews received blame for everything: the military defeat, the economic crisis, and cultural decay. Julius Streicher's newspaper, Der Stürmer, published attacks that combined conspiracy theories with obscenity, claiming Jews supposedly controlled world money, media, and Bolshevism simultaneously. The logical contradiction of being both capitalists and communists didn't matter because only the emotional impact mattered. The swastika became instantly recognizable. Brown uniforms and red flags created visual unity. The Horst Wessel song served as the party's anthem, and the Heil Hitler salute provided instant identification of party members. Everything was designed for simplicity and endless repetition. At the massive Nuremberg rallies, Albert Speer created his famous Cathedral of Light using 130 searchlights pointed straight up into the night sky, creating beams that formed walls of light visible for miles. In his study, The Nationalization of the Masses, historian George Moss documented how these spectacles worked, showing how individual identity dissolved into the crowd while the crowd generated feelings of power. Participants didn't simply observe but felt they were participating in something larger than individual lives, feeling part of history as it happened. The rallies focused on creating an emotional experience of belonging and power rather than discussing ideas or policies. However, the party's most powerful weapon proved to be fear rather than hatred. Vote for Hitler to stop Stalin. The party fought the communist Red Front in the streets, creating an atmosphere of civil war, while middle-class Germans, terrified of Bolshevism, heard a straightforward promise: order would be provided. A temporary dictatorship might be necessary, but that seemed preferable to communist chaos and losing everything to revolution. Business owners feared strikes and property seizures, while conservatives viewed the party as protection against the left, convincing themselves they could control it once the communist threat was blocked. This proved to be a fatal miscalculation, though in the moment, fear overrode caution. Despite all this propaganda, mainstream political parties failed to respond effectively. The Social Democrats remained paralyzed, tolerating increasingly authoritarian rule as a lesser evil, while the Catholic Center Party prioritized church interests and proved willing to negotiate with anyone. The German National People's Party under Alfred Hugenberg actually allied with the movement, and liberal parties collapsed. In October 1931, Otto Schmidt-Hanover observed the party leader speak at a nationalist rally and described him as cocky and scattered, resembling a cross between a prima donna and a Napoleon imitator. Elite circles often viewed him as an unstable speaker rather than a great statesman. Historians debate how much the rise resulted from personal abilities versus structural conditions. In Hitler's 30 Days to Power, Henry Ashby Turner's research revealed the actual mechanism. Photographs were studied to perfect theatrical effects, different approaches were practiced in private, and calculations were made about how to manipulate listeners. This represented systematic work rather than natural genius. In one-on-one meetings, performances were tailored to each person, while at public rallies, crowd psychology techniques learned from books were used. The approach was sophisticated but learned, representing careful preparation combined with a willingness to do whatever proved effective rather than magic or hypnosis. Turner concluded that success came primarily from other people's terrible mistakes rather than personal abilities. Those mistakes were about to multiply as economic disaster struck Germany again. Section 4. The Depression. In October 1929, the Wall Street stock market crashed. In The Coming of the Third Reich, Richard Evans documented how American banks immediately began calling back the short-term loans that had financed German industry's recovery, causing the German economy to collapse. Unemployment rose from 3 million in 1930 to 6 million by 1932, leaving one-third of the workforce without jobs, while soup kitchens and bread lines stretched through every major city. The benefits system couldn't handle the scale of the crisis, leaving insufficient assistance available. Middle-class families feared falling into the working class as their status appeared to slip away, while working-class families faced actual starvation, with children going hungry. According to economic historian Adam Tooze in The Wages of Destruction, the Depression created mass desperation on a scale Germany hadn't experienced since the hyperinflation. When people reach sufficient desperation, they will attempt anything. When normal solutions clearly aren't working, extreme options start to appear reasonable. This created the environment that made the rise of extremist movements possible. As a result, by March 1930, parliamentary government had effectively ended. The deadlock over unemployment insurance brought down the previous government, leading to Heinrich Brüning becoming the first presidential chancellor, governing by emergency decree rather than through parliament. Between 1930 and 1932, Brüning ruled by 109 emergency decrees, while Parliament passed only 29 actual laws. Emergency rule by presidential decree became normalized, meaning Germans grew accustomed to the president making laws without Parliament's approval. Parliamentary debate started to seem slow and chaotic, while strong leadership by decree appeared more efficient. Brüning pursued harsh budget cuts during a depression, which made conditions worse. In Hitler's 30 Days to Power, Turner noted that Brüning had economic policy options, but chose a destructive path because he wanted to prove Germany couldn't pay reparations by intensifying the crisis. This represented foreign policy through domestic suffering, and workers paid the price. Consequently, power shifted to a small group of men around the president. Their private decisions would determine Germany's future. In June 1932, Franz von Papen replaced Brüning. Papen was charming and aristocratic, though according to Turner, deeply dishonest in his dealings. On July 20th, 1932, Papen used Article 48 to remove the elected government of Prussia, Germany's largest state, establishing a precedent that elected governments could be overthrown by presidential decree. The July 1932 election showed how far conditions had deteriorated. The Nazi Party won 37.3% of the vote and 230 seats in parliament, while the Communists won 14.3% and 89 seats. Together, over half of parliament openly opposed democracy, while the Social Democrats held steady but couldn't govern, and the Catholic Center Party and Liberal parties were collapsing. The mathematical reality was severe. No combination of democratic parties could form a working majority. Parliamentary democracy was already mostly dead before Hitler was appointed chancellor, as the system had stopped functioning and a stalemate paralyzed everything. However, the November 6, 1932, election appeared to confirm the Nazi Party's decline, as it dropped from 37.3% to 33.1%, losing 2 million votes in just 4 months. This was the first electoral decline since 1928, and the press widely reported that the movement had peaked and was now collapsing. Kurt von Schleicher became chancellor in December 1932 after engineering Pappen's removal. However, Schleicher lasted only 57 days. He was a political general and backroom schemer who believed he could control everyone, leading Turner to conclude that Schleicher had reached his level of incompetence as chancellor. His attempt to split the party by offering a position to Gregor Strasser backfired completely. Meanwhile, by December, the party faced a severe crisis. The party treasury was nearly empty, and SA members couldn't be paid. Goebbels' diary entries from November reflect despair. On December 8th, Gregor Strasser, Hitler's second-in-command, quit all party offices, creating a sensation that made observers wonder if the party might fall apart altogether. On January 1, 1933, the Frankfurter Zeitung newspaper declared the Nazi threat defeated. According to Turner, Hitler almost abandoned politics entirely on January 27, just 3 days before his appointment as chancellor, breaking off negotiations, refusing to meet with Papen, and threatening to return to Munich. Only with difficulty did Göring and Ribbentrop convince him to stay in the capital. Historians debate whether this apparent collapse made the subsequent appointment more or less likely. Some scholars emphasize that desperation made conservative elites believe they could control a weakened movement. Others contend that the decline actually increased the urgency for a deal before the party disappeared entirely. From either perspective, what happened next would be determined not by elections, but by secret meetings between a small group of men whose private ambitions would shape Germany's fate. Section 5. Elite Miscalculation. On January 4, 1933, at Baron Kurt von Schröder's house in Cologne, Papen and Hitler met secretly. Photographers caught them entering and leaving, providing physical photographic evidence, even though both men issued denials. Only a minority of journalists recognized the conspiratorial significance. This meeting broke Hitler's isolation. Papen wanted revenge against Schleicher for removing him as chancellor, while Hitler needed connections to President Hindenburg. Each man needed what the other could provide, making an alliance possible despite their mutual distrust. 3 weeks later, the conspiracy deepened. On January 22nd, another secret meeting took place at the house of Joachim von Ribbentrop, where Hitler, Papen, Oskar von Hindenburg, and State Secretary Otto Meissner attended. Before the meeting, Oskar opposed Hitler's appointment, but after the meeting, Oskar supported it. Something changed his mind, and historians still debate what occurred, whether there was blackmail involving a financial scandal or whether Oskar was simply convinced that the movement could be controlled. The final moves came swiftly. On January 28th, Schleicher resigned as chancellor. 2 days later, on January 30th, Hindenburg appointed Hitler to replace him. Papen famously declared to associates that conservative elites had hired Hitler and would control him. The cabinet composition appeared to support this confidence. Out of 11 ministers, only 3 were from Hitler's party. Hitler as chancellor, Wilhelm Frick at the interior, and Hermann Göring as a minister without a specific department but controlling Prussia's police. 8 non-Nazis, mostly conservative nationalists, held the other positions. Papen and the other conservatives believed they had Hitler surrounded, assuming they would set policy while he would simply provide mass support and public enthusiasm. In Hitler's 30 Days to Power, historian Henry Ashby Turner identified Papen as the key figure steering events toward disaster, his motivation being personal ambition and a quest for revenge against Schleicher. However, Turner also noted that responsibility greater than Papen's rested with the ultimate decision-maker. Paul von Hindenburg was 85 years old, and contrary to his public image of strength and wisdom, he proved weak and susceptible to manipulation. His personal dislike of Schleicher and preference for Papen outweighed national interest. Hindenburg had the authority to refuse the appointment, but he chose not to exercise it. Historians debate how much the appointment resulted from calculation versus miscalculation. Some scholars emphasize that conservative elites genuinely believed they could control a weakened movement and use it for their own purposes. Others contend that personal feuds and ambitions blinded them to obvious dangers. From either perspective, the consequences became clear immediately. Within hours of his appointment, Hitler began using the system's own rules to destroy it. Section 6. Institutional Collapse. Hitler was appointed through a perfectly legal constitutional process. There was no coup and no constitutional violation, as the president used his authority under Article 48 to appoint a chancellor. Emergency rule had already become normalized by 1933. Germans were accustomed to government by decree, and the parliamentary process was already viewed as slow and chaotic. Hitler simply moved through a door that was already open. Less than a month later, the Reichstag building burned. A Dutch communist named Marinus van der Lubbe was arrested on February 27, 1933, while the government blamed a communist conspiracy. The next day, the Reichstag fire decree canceled civil freedoms, abolishing rights to fair trial, freedom of the press, and freedom of assembly. The emergency was made permanent. Mass arrests of communists and social democrats followed, and the Communist Party was effectively banned before the March 5th election even occurred. In The Coming of the Third Reich, Richard Evans documented how the March 5th election took place under intense SA intimidation at polling places, yet the party still only received 43.9%, not a majority. However, the Enabling Act passed Parliament on March 23 by 444 votes to 94, giving Hitler the power to make laws without Parliament and formally ending parliamentary government. Only the Social Democrats voted against the Enabling Act. Communist deputies were already arrested or in hiding, while the Catholic Center Party voted yes, prioritizing negotiating a treaty with the Vatican over defending democracy. Democracy voted itself out of existence. The transformation accelerated through the spring and summer. The law for restoration of the professional civil service, passed on April 7th, dismissed Jews and political opponents from government jobs. Trade unions were shut down and replaced by a German labor front, while Alfred Hugenberg, who had brought the movement into his nationalist coalition, saw his media empire absorbed into the propaganda apparatus. By June, he was forced out of government. Within weeks of the appointment, respected scholars began supporting the persecution. Protestant church scholar Gerhard Kittel gave a lecture that June advocating for foreign status for Jews, arguing they should lose their citizenship and return to being legal aliens. Kittel called this an ice-cold reason approach, not a sickness of sentimentality. In The Nazi Conscience, historian Claudia Kuhns documented how quickly intellectual respectability aligned with persecution, showing that when professors and clergy endorsed discrimination, it appeared rational rather than hateful. By mid-1934, the final barrier to total control fell. The SS carried out what became known as the Night of the Long Knives on June 30, 1934. The SA under Ernst Röhm had been demanding a second revolution, while conservative elites and the army feared SA radicalism. Hitler ordered the SS to eliminate the SA leadership, resulting in the deaths of Röhm and at least 85 others, with victims also including Gregor Strasser and former Chancellor Kurt von Schleicher. The action eliminated rivals and satisfied conservatives and the army. The conservatives felt relieved, viewing the move as protection from SA radicalism, not realizing they would become targets later. Meanwhile, Every institution fell into line. Civil servants mostly kept their positions if they swore loyalty to the regime, judges continued in office and enforced new laws, and police merged with the SS to become instruments of control. There was no institutional resistance. Within 18 months, legal powers had been used to build a dictatorship. Understanding how these separate problems converged requires examining the multiple causes. In Hitler's 30 Days to Power, Turner emphasized that the rise resulted from multiple causes working together, not one factor, but many. Economic despair from hyperinflation and the Depression destroyed trust in normal politics. Political collapse made parliamentary government impossible, and Article 48 rule became normalized. Cultural crisis divided the city from the countryside and class from class. Weak institutions from Bismarck's constitution provided no resistance, and elite mistakes from Papen, Hindenburg, and Schleicher opened the door. Fear of communism pushed conservatives toward the movement, while propaganda provided emotional belonging and promises of national revival. All of these factors were necessary. None alone was sufficient. The hyperinflation of 1923 destroyed middle-class savings and created permanent distrust, while the Depression of 1929 to 1932 destroyed working-class jobs and created desperation. Together, they made millions willing to attempt anything. The parliamentary system was already paralyzed by 1930, meaning democracy was mostly dead 3 years before the appointment as chancellor. Emergency rule by presidential decree had become normalized, while fear of communism mobilized conservatives who believed they could use the movement and then discard it. The propaganda offered more than economic solutions. It offered emotional belonging. In Germans into Nazis, historian Peter Fritzsche documented how the memory of August 1914 continued to influence German politics. As in the war's first weeks, Germans had experienced unprecedented national unity. The Burgfrieden, or fortress peace, meant all classes stood together, and this memory remained powerful. The Volksgemeinschaft, or people's community, appealed to this memory with promises to recreate that feeling of unity and purpose. The promise was false, as the unity came through exclusion, but for those included, the emotional appeal was strong. Mass rallies created feelings of participation in something larger than individual lives, while uniforms, anthems, and rituals provided identity and purpose, especially for unemployed young men who had nothing else. This explains an important pattern. Economic solutions alone wouldn't have prevented the rise. The appeal wasn't simply jobs, but meaning, belonging, and national revival. Those emotional appeals competed with and sometimes overpowered material self-interest. The party built on long-standing European prejudices against Jews. They didn't invent hatred, but intensified what already existed and gave it political purpose. Jews received blame for military defeat, economic crisis, cultural decay, and communist threat, while conspiracy theories claimed Jews controlled both capitalism and communism. The logical contradiction didn't matter. The persecution followed a clear progression. Civil freedoms were canceled in February 1933. Jewish professionals were dismissed from civil service in April 1933. The Nuremberg laws canceled citizenship for Jews and banned marriage between Jews and other Germans in 1935. Kristallnacht saw organized destruction across Germany in 1938, where around 200 Jews were killed and thousands were arrested. The systematic killing began in 1941. In Nazi Germany and the Jews, historian Saul Friedlander documented how the path from discrimination to annihilation functioned, showing how each step made the next one easier. Once rights have been removed, once a group has been made into legal outsiders, once they've been accepted as dangerous, killing becomes conceivable, then possible, then systematic. 6 million Jews died in what became known as the Holocaust, while millions more died from other groups the regime targeted: Romani people, disabled individuals, political opponents, Soviet prisoners of war, and Polish civilians. Historians identify several figures whose decisions determined the outcome. Franz von Papen was a key figure in steering events toward disaster, according to Turner. Personal ambition and revenge outweighed national interest. However, Paul von Hindenburg held final responsibility, as he could have refused the appointment but chose not to. His personal dislike of Schleicher, his preference for Papen, and his susceptibility to manipulation by his son and by Meissner all played roles in determining Germany's fate. Kurt von Schleicher believed he could control everyone, but was outplayed completely. Alfred Hugenberg allied with the movement, believing he could use it for conservative ends. But by June 1933, Hugenberg had lost everything. All of them believed they could maintain control. All of them were wrong. They didn't understand what kind of movement they were confronting, thinking in terms of normal politics involving compromise, coalition, and mutual interest, while it operated in terms of total power or nothing. Germany's constitution had structures that facilitated authoritarian rule built in from 1871. Article 48 provided a constitutional mechanism for emergency powers. Emergency rule became normalized from 1930 to 1933, and judges were already biased toward the right. Civil servants, police, and the army kept their positions and mostly cooperated, meaning there was no institutional resistance. The legal path to expanded executive power was already established. The system wasn't broken by the dictatorship. The system facilitated it. Even with all these factors, historians debate whether the rise was inevitable or could have been prevented. Henry Turner's answer was clear. No, this was not inevitable. The party was declining in November 1932. Money problems threatened collapse, and Strasser's resignation created a crisis. The situation nearly fell apart on January 27th. The secret Cologne meeting occurred by chance, and the Lippe election on January 15th provided a propaganda victory through timing that occurred by chance, according to Turner. However, Richard Evans emphasized that broken structures made disaster possible, as constitutional flaws, cultural crisis, and economic disaster created conditions where elite errors could become fatal. Ian Kershaw concluded that prevention was possible but not easy because too many systems were failing simultaneously. From one perspective, the appointment wasn't certain on January 1, 1933. Meaning different personalities, different choices, and slightly different timing could have changed everything. From another perspective, the structures were weak, the crisis was deep, and the choices available were limited, meaning prevention would have required wisdom, courage, and unity that didn't exist. Understanding these patterns matters because democracies remain vulnerable. They require active defense rather than passive hope. Elites cannot control extremists they empower. Temporary emergency powers tend to become permanent, and fear assists authoritarian movements more than democratic ones. Economic despair combined with cultural division creates dangerous conditions. Propaganda functions through large falsehoods and emotional manipulation, and institutional safeguards must be actively maintained. Democracies don't collapse all at once but fail through a series of small surrenders. Emergency powers that were supposed to be temporary became normalized. Judges who should have been neutral tilted toward one side, and leaders who should have defended the system believed they could use an extremist for their own ends. People facing economic despair and cultural crisis chose belonging over freedom. Democracies require constant watchfulness and are not self-sustaining, depending instead on people willing to defend them, even when doing so is difficult. The collapse that brought Hitler to power began long before 1933. It started with a republic born from defeat in November 1918, continued through the Treaty of Versailles in June 1919 and the hyperinflation of 1923, and developed through constitutional weaknesses that allowed emergency rule to become normalized. It accelerated with the Depression that began in October 1929 and culminated in the backroom deals of January 1933. As Henry Turner documented in Hitler's 30 Days to Power, Hitler didn't seize power through genius or inevitability, but moved through a door that others opened for him. The research makes one conclusion clear. Democracies don't collapse all at once, but fail through a series of small surrenders. Emergency powers that were supposed to be temporary became normalized. Judges who should have been neutral tilted toward one side, and leaders who should have defended the system instead believed they could use an extremist for their own ends. A population facing economic despair and cultural crisis chose belonging over freedom. Germany's collapse into dictatorship was not inevitable, but it was also not simply a chance. It occurred because systems designed to protect democracy had deep flaws, because economic disasters created desperation, and because people who should have known better made terrible choices. Understanding how it occurred doesn't simply explain history, but shows what to watch for in any democracy facing similar pressures. Hitler's rise was preventable, but the world he tried to create reveals an even darker vision. To see what would have happened if Germany had won the war, watch this video next.